Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So, this is the very last session, the concluding session of the course. So, I do not intend to say anything completely new, except for I will just summarize what we did for the entire course so far. So, this is kind of a wrap up session. So, I will quickly summarize all the sessions that we did, and also leave you with some ideas and questions that you can wonder and reflect on. So, I will give you a set of kind of questions which you could probably reflect on, and I expect people who took this course would be able to reflect on these using some of the concepts that we have dealt with, and also the kind of what we did through the course is we traced the evolution of the media, we talked about models of communications, and then we discussed a bunch of explanatory tools with which you could think through some of the concerns that pervades the digital ecology and practices concerning internet practices. Yeah, so we discussed we started out with the definition of new media, and we discussed that media technologies that were new in the yesteryears are old today, and those that are new today will also be old in the future. So, new and old is kind of a temporal thing which is subjective, but then new media is probably not a function of time. Like the newness of the new media is not just a function of time. We talked about Raymond Williams, and we talked about how Raymond Williams traces the semantic evolution of the word media. So, how media means what it means, kind of traced the way in which the word evolved over time, and he talks about the divergence of meanings that the word may have had in the previous years, even centuries, and how it evolved into meaning what it means today. We talked about the significance of new media as a recent trend, like new media as in it signifies a recent trend in access and the use of media. Like on contrary to looking into new media as a temporal function, we talked about new media as a trend, as a fashion, as a tendency. Tendency is probably a better expression. New media is a tendency to have access to certain kind of resources, certain kind of devices, certain kind of technology, certain kind of networks. So, it refers to the on demand access to content anytime, anywhere, any device, and this ubiquity of devices like multiple devices, multiple screen, multiple networking devices. So, that is a characteristic of new media. So, we talked about the user based interactability, like oftentimes this is coupled with user based customization, like we just in the preceding session we talked about how Google or Facebook has a gatekeeping mechanism and in place, and they customize things that we see on these platforms. So, there is this number one, user based interactability, like users on Wikipedia are networked through Wikipedia, users of Facebook are networked through Facebook, and so on and so forth. So, it is a user based networking, and in oftentimes this is customized based on the user database and the using history, browsing history. So, there is this interactability, the question of interactability and the question of customization, which engages into a sustained and critical questioning of the impulse to assume ourselves as passive consumers. So the reason I call this an impulse to assume ourselves as passive consumers, because this was the idea which was generally associated with the traditional or broadcast media like the radio or the newspaper. So, we have discussed this, how the passive consumers in the context of the broadcast media is now interactive to the extent that the content is now customized based on demand. So, like if you look into the on demand music channels, if you look into the live streaming websites like Amazon Prime, for example, the content on Amazon Prime, like if there's, so these streaming based platforms, if there is not enough audience, they might stop a program. If there's a demand for a certain program, certain content, they often start a new season for it. So, this is also like the content is also customized and based on demand. So, this is in direct repudiation to how the consumers were perceived to be passive recipient of the content in the broadcast media era. So, we discussed this. So, the new media in doing so does away with the producer consumer diet, like the producer becomes the consumer and the consumer becomes the producer. So, it is kind of a nuanced circuitry, like we have talked about this. So, it is not about dyad, and if you recall the Stuart Hall model here, information or content does not necessarily flow from the producer to the consumer. Consumer also determines what kind of content that ought to be produced, what kind of content would yield revenue, TRP, whatever that is. Lev Manovich has this interesting propositions, like 8 set of propositions, and he coins these 8 propositions which he thinks are characteristic of the new media. So, number 1, Malovich says, and this is like Malovich's articulation, not mine, he sees new media as different from cyber cultures. It is not just cyber culture, it is not just a set of computers or computing practices. So, there is this question of networking which is exceedingly important, like the internet. So, it is not just cyber culture, it is not just computers, there is network, there is internet, and there is the question of subjectivity, power, hierarchy, privilege, and so on and so forth. Number 2, he says computer technology used as distribution platform, that is something along the lines of which we have been discussing. And if you recall digital divide here, like both distribution and access endorse certain kind of hierarchies and privileges. So, computer technology that are being used as distribution platform is the second characteristic Malovich observes of the new media. Number 3, digital media controlled by software. So, software is in like if you now recall the example, like the gatekeeping mechanism in Facebook or Google, artificial intelligence, robots, cookies, browsing histories, and so on and so forth, they determine a great extent of how the digital media functions. So, digital media is controlled by software. Number 4, the mix between existing cultural conventions and the conventions of the software. So, there is this overlap, there is this overlap between how existing cultures, and if you can recall the session when we discussed netiquette. So, there is this overlap, there is this convergence, like the conventions of the software versus conventions that traditionally exist. Number 5, the aesthetics that accompanies the earlier stage of new modern media and communication technology. So, Malovich sees there is a parallel temporal development. So, whatever stage new modern media or early communication technology was in, new media is kind of emergent new media is undergoing a similar kind of development process. Number 6, faster execution of algorithms previously executed manually or through other technologies. Number 8, the encoding of modernist avant-garde as meta media, and number 8, parallel articulation of similar ideas in World War II art and modern computing. So, these are the 8 characteristics of new media according to Lev Manovich, which you could probably reflect on these, you could probably develop these. You do not have to be necessarily in agreement with Manovich here. This could again be our analytical tool, our cues to think through the practice and the process of digital media. We discussed about Ferdinand de Saussure's model that explains interpersonal communication, and we kind of also invoked Ferdinand de Saussure in the context that his model is a closed model. It's a loop. It's a closed loop where information flows from producer to consumer, as opposed to the new media that kind of circuits these loop. We talked about Roman Jakobson's model, which explains interpersonal communication. However, it considers intervening context, code and message. So, Jakobson's model helped to explain person to person communication, and he gave us certain cues: context, code and message. So, how these are important in the way we make sense of certain communication. We discussed Stuart Hall's model, in the way in which Stuart Hall's model kind of betters the other pre-existing models. We talked about how Stuart Hall seeks to explain mass media instead of interpersonal communication. So, this was kind of an evolutionary step in the progress of new media. So, it is a Stuart Hall seeks to explain mass media instead of interpersonal communication. He considers the structures of knowledge and the relations of power. This was very important, which did not occur to the Roman Jakobson or Ferdinand de Saussure. So, Stuart Hall for the first time talks about relations of power and issues of ideology that intervene in the process of communication. The ideological biases, we had a whole lot of discussion on ideological biases, time bias, space bias, so on and so forth. So, this is considered the cornerstone. I mean, if Lev Manovich is a very crucial thinker when it comes to new media, in my understanding, again one might disagree with this, in my understanding Stuart Hall's approach to mass media, the way he sought to understand the relations of power and the questions of ideology, I think is the cornerstone for understanding some of the critical issues of new media today. So, then we went on to discuss Marshall McLuhan and Harold Innis. We talked about Marshall McLuhan's tetrad model, which considers the following questions, while we considered Marshall McLuhan's the tetrad model. This analyzes the new media. I mean, Marshall McLuhan, I mean, look at the evolution here, like Ferdinand de Saussure, Roman Jakobson, Stuart Hall, Marshall McLuhan. So, we see a line of thinkers who were kind of engaging with what was contemporary at their time. So, they were engaging with the most recent articulation of media technologies. So, what the Marshall McLuhan model, the tetrad model, prompts us to ask is, what does any technology enhance, what does it make obsolete, what does it retrieve that has already been obsolete earlier, what does it flip into, when it is pushed to extremes. So, these are the 4 set of questions, and if you recall the grid that we discussed when we discussed McLuhan, helps us understand again some of the coordinates of new media. We discussed Harold Innis with respect to the biases of media technologies. We talked about time bias and space bias. So, every media, old or new, is biased. It has its own ideological bias. It has its own kind of privileges that it endorses. So, it endorses certain things and it discourages certain other things. So, it is very important to know whenever you seek to study the structure or the sociological impact of any media technology. It is very important to understand what is it that it does encourage, what it is that it discourages. So, I think Harold Innis is a critical interlocutor here who helps us think through these questions, the question of ideology. Then we talked about the massive proliferation of the internet and how it has led to the birth of a kind of a digital natives, netizen, and we talked about the indispensability of the internet, like the digital platform, and precisely with respect to the Dana Boyd reading that we discussed, like the whole idea of being always on, being always online. So, this speaks to the question of indispensability of the internet, the FOMO, the FOMO syndrome, the fear of missing out syndrome, and so on and so forth. So, that is also very important. The new media is participatory, it is empowering, it is democratizing to a great extent. We discussed this with respect to Wikipedia, how Wikipedia lets anyone edit the content, and so on and so forth. There could be numerous examples. If you look into the Arab Spring and the discourse centering the protests that happened at that point of time in that part of the world, there were a series of protests, and how the new media technologies were exceedingly crucial in bringing about certain political changes in certain parts of the world, speaks to how new media can be participatory, empowering, democratizing, so on and so forth. But there is a caveat here. That said, the virtual public sphere also fosters digital divide, it also fosters filter bubble, and it is susceptible to data mining, it is susceptible to surveillance, it is susceptible to sphericulating certain identities, like insulating certain identities, certain subjectivities. So, these are two sides of the same coins. Like the point is not to think in terms of binaries, like the new media does both, like it is democratizing, it is participatory to a great extent, but the caveat is it is also susceptible to certain odds, it is also susceptible to digital divide and filter bubble and so on. Yeah, so the question is not to think in terms of binary. I mean, it's probably unproductive to ask whether new media is democratizing, liberalizing, or is it the question is not about whether it is good or bad. The question is to understand the nature and the structure in which the new media functions. So, I think these are again two critical points of departure, the liberal and the democratizing aspect of the new media, and we have the susceptibility of the new media, questions of filter bubble and digital divide in particular. So, it happens at the same time, these are parallel processes. So, it is better to again to remain open to both these ideas when we think about the new media. So, based on the discussions that we have had so far, there could be three approaches to studying new media, and let me tell you in the concluding remarks that these are not exhaustive approaches. I mean, there could be other approaches, but based on what we did mostly through the course of our discussion in this course. There could be three, again I like reiterate, this is not at all exhaustive. There are other ways of studying new media. Based on whatever discussions we have had, we see three ways, three approaches that we may take, and this may help you when you write or speak about new media, when you study new media, when you try to make sense of things concerning our digital practices or our internet behavior. Number one, the communication studies approach. It considers diffusion of innovative models, rates of adoption of technologies by users. So, you study, it's a kind of a, you study how certain innovative models are diffused, how they proliferate, to what extent they proliferate. Say for example, ICT devices, one could look into, from a communication studies approach, one could look into to what extent, for example, ICT devices have penetrated the primary classrooms in India, for example. So, that is a communication studies approach. You look into the diffusion, you look into the proliferation, you look into the impact, you do a quantitative study of the nature of permeation. Number two could be a political economy approach. It considers, again, like Stuart Hall is a very important figure here. It considers ownership and control of media, flows of capital, like who owns media convergence, like one of the concepts that we have discussed in one of the earlier sessions. Like for example, there are only few media corporations in the context of US that owns most of the media houses, broadcast, print, internet, whatever. Like most media houses, most media companies in the US is actually owned by a very few very big media corporations. So, the ownership is converged to a few very few minuscule corporations. So, that could be a, if one may want to understand what is the nature of how capital flows, what is the nature of these convergence, and naturally if there are only certain people that own the majority of media houses or media platforms, they'll exercise the maximum control over what information gets coded in those platforms. The more penetrative, is the ownership, the more will these certain few corporations will have in determining what they would broadcast, what they would publish, and so on and so forth. So, this is like a political economy approach. You look into the proliferation of capital and its impact on codification of information as it exists in media platforms. Number three could be a cultural studies approach, and that is the more of a kind, that is a more of a Marshall McLuhan, Harold Innis kind of approach. The cultural studies approach would consider the ideological apparatus, the ideological biases, the nature of ideological biases, questions of the sort that we were discussing in the last sessions, the culture question precisely, and the relations of power, freedom of use for users, like the kind of the Wikipedia entry, for example, that we saw, that charted out the countries according to their access to the bandwidth speed. So, that would be, if you that kind of a study would be a cultural studies line of approach. In sum, what we covered in this course is this three broad approach to media studies: communication studies approach, political economy approach, and cultural studies approach. So, these are the three approaches. But then we also discussed a bunch of concepts like the always on lifestyle, the filter bubble, the digital divide, remediation, ideological biases, and so on and so forth. Like these, the approach on the other hand, the three approaches, and we discuss certain tools. So, imagine these to be your analytical, you have approach on the one hand, you have certain tools on the other hand, and you could use these as a methodological intervention. This could help you when you study the new media. In conclusion, I will leave you open with a few questions maybe, and my expectation is, having done this course, you would be able to better understand and think through some of these concerns, and also be self reflective on your, like, as netizens, as digital natives, presumably you would be able to better reflect, self reflect on your own digital practices and the digital ecology in which that each one of us inhabits. So, for example, how do new media devices or new media technologies influence the way we do things, communicate with one another? Does the quality of participation increase or decrease? Like there is this constant debate and anxiety where people say, well, one-to-one conversation is better, the way we sent out formal invitations back then was better. So, of course, like in any age whatsoever, this is nothing new, this is nothing recent, like that, like people are like torn into two minds. There are people who have a traditionalist understanding, like things in the past were like the golden past kind of argument, like things in the past were always already better. And there are people who look up to like the newer who embrace newer technologies more easily or more openly. So, torn between these two sides, you could probably think about what you do, like anything, the way you write your homework, write your assignment, the way you look up information. So, what would people do like 20 years back, like without the internet, like how would they search for information? They would have encyclopedias, they would have Britannica encyclopedia, and so on and so forth, like library consultation and so on and so forth. So, you could probably think like take any media technology, take any media device. I am saying device or technology, it could be the mobile phone. You could just think of your cellular phone and think of what does the mobile phone, how does the mobile phone influence you to do certain things. So, what does WhatsApp, for example, it is a media technology. What does WhatsApp as a technology do? How does it impact the way you talk with your friends, networks, and so on? What cultural practices encourage the use of new media and active participation? So, to what extent is globalization responsible for the rise of new media, like with the ubiquity of the internet and networks, and also other forms of, it is just not media technologies, there are other forms of communication, like physical communication, like travel, for example, physical travel, logistics, travel and tourism, for example. So, with each of these things in place, like the communication, both physical and media communication, have become easier to a great extent. So, with globalization also there has been this boom and emergence of the new media. So, you could look into to what extent is globalization responsible for the rise of new media, and what kind of cultural practices, and if you go the cultural studies line of approach, you could probably reflect on culture, like what kind of culture encourages to use the new media, or certain renditions of new media are popular in certain culture. Like for example, China prohibits, for example, use of certain like like Google based applications. So, what most Chinese internet users would have a replica, like a replacement for the Google based apps, or I think Line is an app which is a replacement for WhatsApp. So, you could probably look into why is it that China has Line and the rest of the world, probably very broadly speaking, use WhatsApp, like WhatsApp is not popular in China. So, that would be a cultural studies line of argument. Why is it that China has its own counterpart of WhatsApp? So, imagine that's the third question that I will request you to reflect on. So, imagine a digital interface that you frequently use, WhatsApp, emails, whatever that is. Now, apply McLuhan's tetrad model to it. Think about the piece of technology or the interface that you are using, and you try to study that. It is a self-reflexive study, of course. You try to think through that with McLuhan's tetrad model. So, what does it enhance, what does it make obsolete, and how does it retrieve that has already been obsolete earlier. So, you could look into these. So, that would be an exercise, and that would help you determine whether you have understood McLuhan's model or the tenor of the course more generally speaking. So, McLuhan claims, and I quote McLuhan here, we shape our tools and afterwards our tools shape us. I'll give you an example, like we human beings have made the traffic signals, for example, the traffic lights, but now when we drive our cars, we stop at the traffic light. So, the traffic signals now control us. So, taking cues from here, you could try to explain the idea of techno-determinism. I mean, these are concepts again we discussed, like social determinism and techno-determinism, and how media scholars are again torn between these two sides, like two kind of approaches to studying media. So, Marshall McLuhan, as he says, like we shape our tools and afterwards our tool shape us. I mean, this is the basic tenet, this is the staple of techno-determinism. So, can you reflect on techno-determinism and take a stance in relation to the statement of McLuhan's that I just read out, while making references to some of the concepts that we have discussed. Yeah, the next thing is I will ask you to pick a meme or a blog. Like I did a similar exercise when I showed you the meme from the JNU protests. So, I did a kind of a similar exercise. So, can you take cue from there and pick any random thing, like any random digital artifact, of course. Pick a meme or a blog or a social networking profile of your choice, like your friend's profile maybe on the internet, and explain the concept of digital divide. It could be also your own Facebook profile, like the kind of friends you have made, kind of friends you have unfriended, and the kind of friends that you want to make friends with. Look at the networks and try to study the social impact and the cultural impact of such networking, and also the cultural disposition that endorses that kind of a networking. So, try to think about what are the cultural conditions that shape the network that you have built, and what kind of cultural implications that kind of networking might have on your digital practices. So, in other words, think through the concept of digital divide through this particular profile or blog or a meme that you select. So, use that as a case study and reflect on digital divide. Yes. So, now it is a cliche to say digital technology has changed our lives, like the internet has brought about a revolution and so on and so forth, and the Arab Spring example that I gave you, but it has become a cliche, like it is obvious, like everyone knows about it. From your own hands-on experience, can you compare in terms of the novelty of broadcast media and the social media. So, I mean, it's a cliche, as I said, to claim that, well, everything has changed since we have new media, but can you think of concrete examples? Can you do comparison between broadcast media and social media and give us clear examples of how things have changed? So, how is online journalism? We also discussed this in the context of indie journalism and new media journalism and so on. So, how is online journalism different from print journalism? You could think of examples from reportages that you read. Maybe you could, one exercise that you could do, and I think it would be fun, like if you could look into say like the same kind of news reportage. So, for example, Team India's performance in Cricket World Cup, you could pull this up, this same set of reportages from across different media platforms, both online, print, and then try to compare. Like you could pull it up from the news feed that is there on your phone, you could pull this up from the newspaper that you read, you could pull this up from any other media sources. You could have at least 2, if not more, media same or similar reportages from across different platforms and try to compare. So, what kind of linguistic registers do they use? Say, for example, I'll help you with a cue. The online journalism, for example, would have hyperlinks. The newspaper does not have hyperlinks. So, that is a clear example. That's a clear example of a difference. So, can you think of the differences in a more nuanced way? Can you demonstrate with reference to any media of your choice how the 3 approaches that we have discussed so far, cultural studies, political economy, and communication studies, of studying new media are related, are actually interrelated? So, again I said the point is to have a holistic understanding of the new media, or for that matter any subject. Like, because you are taking a communication studies line of approach does not mean that you should be in a filter bubble and shut yourself off to other approaches. So, can you think of the ways in which these 3 approaches actually are in conversation, they speak to each other. So, with the series of theorists that we did, McLuhan, Harold Innis, Jacobson, Stuart Hall, and so on, can you talk about the interrelatedness of these 3 approaches? So, do you perceive the issue of techno surveillance in the context of new media a serious threat, a breach of privacy, and so on, like as we have discussed in our sessions on artificial intelligence and so on, as we have discussed in our earlier sessions, like our browsing history, our cookies are being tracked and we are under surveillance all the time. The way in which Amazon determines people who bought this also bought this, the way in which our cookie history and our cookies and browsing history are made sense of is a serious threat to our privacy, and there are more concrete and more pressing examples, like the Amazon example is just a very innocent and not of a grave nature, so to say. I mean, there are intelligent agencies who data mine. There are data selling, for example, like people mine data and sell it to third parties and so on and so forth. So, techno surveillance, like and the whole anxiety that centers the Aadhaar card or the National Register of Citizenship in Assam. I mean, that is a huge issue right now. I mean, that is unfolding in Assam right now. So, these are some of the digital networks and digital platforms that rekindle our anxiety concerning techno surveillance and breach of privacy. So, can you think of issues of surveillance and privacy and so on with concrete examples from new media? So, that are the few questions that I will leave you with, and whatever we did through the sessions, I hope would help you reflect on these in a more meaningful and effective way. And I expect you to have acquired the tools and the methodologies to better explain the digital ecology and the practices that concerns our media practices. So, the role that these technologies play in transforming and being transformed by the society, the policies that shape the development of this media, and vice versa, and the way they shape and control us, and the place they occupy in reality, in our imagination, and the way that they govern our media practices.